Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast. Really has been a year of ups and downs, but who would have thought that we'd be sitting here towards the end of the year with the oil price in the low $60? South Africa's energy debate has really become a kind of Rorschach test, though. If you look at the same set of facts, 33% unemployment in South Africa, youth joblessness above 60%, years of load shedding, growth stuck below 1%. And you can see either a compelling case for unlocking every molecule of domestic energy we can find, or an unforgivable gamble with our climate commitments and our oceans. And nowhere is that tension sharper than the offshore oil and gas sector. On the one side, you've got industry bodies like the Offshore Petroleum Association of South Africa arguing that we're sitting on a missed opportunity. We've got projects like Block 11B and 12B off the south coast, estimates of tens of thousands of jobs, billions in annual GDP, and a chance to reindustrialize and stabilize the fiscus, especially when neighbors like Namibia are pulling billions of dollars of investment and planning to double GDP on the back of their new finds. And on the other, you've got civil society and climate scientists pointing out that 95% of our offshore area is already under some form of oil and gas exploration, even as government promised to protect 30% of our marine environment by 2030. And they're warning that these new long-lived fossil projects are fundamentally at odds with South Africa's net zero pledge. And all of this is playing out in a global system that's fragmenting. Capital is decarbonizing fast. We've got multilateral climate ambitions under pressure. A Trump White House once again rowing back from painstakingly negotiated climate discipline, while Europe doubles down on green standards and carbon border taxes. I think for bankers and investors, the question isn't ideological. It's brutally practical. Which projects can you still fund and which will sit on your balance sheet as stranded assets? So tonight, we're going to sit right in the middle of that crossfire. My guest is Niall Kramer, the newly appointed national spokesperson for the Offshore Petroleum Association of South Africa, OPASA. And we're going to unpack OPASA's case that offshore oil and gas is not just an economic opportunity, but in their words, a moral imperative for South Africa's youth. And with that, Niall, let's start with welcoming you onto the show. Welcome, firstly. Share with us a little bit more about your background in the oil and gas industry. You're a former Chevron and Shell executive. You were previously head of the SA Oil and Gas Alliance. How did you find your way into the fossil fuel industry?
Thank you, Michael. It's a very full introduction. I found my way into the industry entirely by chance. I had been a teacher, and a friend of mine who was particularly grumpy about his job was complaining and saying, I don't like my job and I want to do something else. And we had a conversation and said, well, you need to do something about it. And the Sunday Times had a very full jobs supplement in those days. And we opened this up and there was an ad looking for people with the kind of experience that we had. And he said, well, he's not going to apply because he was just basically being very negative. And I said, guess what? I'm going to give these people a call. I did. It worked out. And I then joined what was then Caltex in human resources. And that was not a particularly good fit. One thing led to another. And I went into then public affairs, corporate affairs, marketing through many functions in South Africa, in Southeast Asia. They set up a marketing function for the then Caltex markets, which were all over the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And then gradually I moved on to other jurisdictions like Thailand and back here, and then back to New Zealand. And then Caltex merged with Chevron and Texaco, who were the two owners. And through all of the iterations of corporate shape, I went from one function to another. And then they sold the African markets, and I then left. And right at that time, Shell were going into the fracking controversy in the Karoo, and I jokingly said to friends at the time that there are only two jobs that I'd really like to do now, and the one would be to work with BP, who are having some excitement around the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf, and the other was the Shell project in the Karoo. And out of the blue, the Shell option came in. And that's how it was purely by chance. One thing led to another. It wasn't
Wow.
some great strategic
Yeah.
play at
Well,
all.
often they say opportunity leads strategy in these things, and as
Yep.
opportunity knocks, yeah. Given that background, and it's quite interesting to see the evolution of the downstream. And when we talk about the downstream, the forecourts and the fuel retail
Hmm.
businesses of the majors, Caltex selling out to an extent, Shell divesting its downstream. What do you think is driving this shift?
I don't think it's a new shift. The downstream business has been under pressure for a number of years, and quite a lot of these players have been looking for buyers. And so, for example, in the Chevron move on selling out to Glencore to Astron, they were looking to strategically consolidate markets that are close to where they got their supply, could refine it, and take it to valuable customers, which was predominantly the west coast of the US. And since the fracking revolution in the Obama days, when the economy was not so good, then not Chevron, but the industry developed deep fracking, and the industry just took off from there. And it was one of the prime activities that turned the US economy around, especially from the Permian Basin. So
Yeah.
these are long-term strategic shifts, but certainly, the opportunity we're looking at now in the upstream in South Africa, when you look at the difference between the upstream and the downstream industry, the scale is entirely different. The risk and the opportunity in upstream is really, really big compared to what happens in the downstream.
Yeah.
And the downstream is not, as people often think, is not the only outlet for the upstream business. So in this business, when you explore and you drill, and hopefully, and not always, you can produce that oil or gas, that then goes into a number of activities, not only transport, through forecourts, but also into electricity and into petrochemicals. It ends up in bitumen and roads and so on. So it's a wide variety of products that come from what the upstream produces.
And it's so interesting. There's so many issues to unpack in that. But when I first read the new map by Daniel Jurgen, I wasn't fully aware, and I'm sure you're aware of the book. And he wrote the map, which was, I think, a book for which he won the Pulitzer Prize, all about oil. But then in the new map, he really goes into a great detail and depth into just how transformative the exploitation of shale was for the US economy. So maybe you could just sketch that out for us and what the opportunity set is in exploiting our endowment of oil and gas if we do it responsibly.
Well, basically, what happened in the US is they were net importers and were at the receiving end of geopolitical risk from the Middle East and elsewhere. And with the fracking revolution, they became net exporters of oil and gas. And prior to the large scale development of oil and gas from fracking, they had started through a company called Shenia Al Shuf, I think the guy's name was, and he had built a whole lot of import terminals for LNG along the coast. And then the fracking revolution came along and literally upended everything to the point that they became net exporters and were able to then turn these import facilities, turn them around into export facilities. So it's a fascinating story. There's a book called The Frackers, which covers the whole story really, really well. But I think the key point here is the transformative opportunity that oil and gas has. So here in South Africa, if the deep water exploration goes ahead, and it in all likelihood will, the opportunity in terms of they're not small numbers, they're billions of US dollars that would come in investment to produce this oil and gas. And the transformative nature of that, I think you might have touched on that in your intro around Namibia. and people talking about doubling the size of the GDP from the success that they are currently having. That is something that is absolutely, it's huge in terms of impact for a country. Now, South Africa, we have an economy growing at what, 1%? The rest of Africa, probably something around 3 to 5%, but we're certainly not keeping up with population growth. And we're going to need a massive injection of capital and opportunity to turn that around. And people often say, well, is there risk in that? Yes, well, of course, there's risk in that. There always is. But the good thing about South Africa is that it is already a highly diversified economy. Yes, previously predominantly reliant on mining, but it's huge in terms of banking, telecoms, and not so much in manufacturing. Here is the opportunity to reindustrialize the country. And whether this would be a blessing or a curse is largely dependent on the policies that are in place to distribute that opportunity and use it for the good of everyone. And people assume, because there are bad examples around the world of how, Dutch disease has taken off and skewed prices for locals. The good examples, and easily the best one anywhere, is Norway, where they had a set of rules which they called their 10 commandments for oil and gas, and recognized that it was simply a bond-seller. And from an economy that was largely based on, forestry and fishing, they developed a hugely successful economy, but didn't use all of the benefits at once, put these into a
Sovereign
sovereign,
wealth.
yes, which is now over $1 trillion, and admittedly not investing in oil and gas anymore, but it is something that is very helpful when you're smoothing out the economy and things are going south. And you just have to look at the quality of life in a country like that, with
Yeah.
cycles, education, security, and a highly, highly skilled workforce. So, that's my vision of the future here that could come about.
Looking at Energio's work, just trying to put some numbers on Brill Putter and Block 11B and 12B alone, they could support, we're talking about over 20,000 direct and indirect jobs and adding about 23 billion rand a year to GDP.
Yeah.
Some critics might say, okay, modeling is one thing, but the actual offtake and execution is quite another. It's deep water, some very violent coastline. That how robust are those jobs and GDP numbers really, and over what time frame would we be looking at if we had the right enabling policies in place?
Yeah, well, Energio are certainly highly regarded for their modeling, but they're not the only people out there doing it. And 11B, 12B is just one part of this. There's the Deepwater Orange Basin, there's the West Coast, there's the coast going up through the East Coast, KZN. So, assuming more than a couple of these come off, the opportunity is absolutely massive. And the thing to remember here is that what we are playing with is not our money. This is other people's money at other people's risk. And in the early stages, they will be looking to do seismic exploration as opposed to production drilling, and then potentially appraisal drilling. And the key here is that in the early stages, you're drilling for data, not necessarily for gas or oil. Of course, that's what you ultimately are there to find, but probably 7 out of 10 drills end up as a no-go. And if you are only taking 30% of the holes, the risk that you've taken and have not paid out on the 7 has to be paid out of the 3. And for us as citizens in a very small economy, it's key that we make the environment for these investors attractive for them to come in and want to explore here. And of course, the nearby example for that attractiveness is the pragmatism that Namibia have shown. And yeah, I wish that had been us.
Yeah, and we'll come to Namibia's dual track strategy. But when we talk about the IRP,
Yes.
the most recent iteration that I've seen allocates, what is it, 6,000 megawatts of gas to power by 2030 and up to 16 gigawatts by 2039. It is
Yes.
silent on how we actually secure those gas molecules. Do you think that's a bit of a policy contradiction? I mean, how do you reconcile a fairly gas heavy IRP with a country that has no functioning gas import terminals and no revived domestic gas to liquids plant?
Well, there's no question there will be challenges in that. So, 6 gigawatts by 2030, and then, another large tranche by 2039. So the documents are all out on that. I see they've just undergone some revisions, but during next year, they would reach commercial and then financial close. But even after that, that puts the entire risk for supply on whoever is bidding, and they will have to produce the gas. What they can't do is bring the gas in unless there are FSRUs, floating storage units, regas units, storage at the ports, pipelines, and so on. So that will take some years to develop. And I suppose the upside in all of that from our point of view as advocates for gas is that the numbers, although they may appear high, are there. In previous iterations of the IRP, they were not that high and they were contested. And there's clearly a recognition of the catalytic role that gas can play. And right, so now we have to put this infrastructure in place and get this going. The other piece in here that's worth touching on is the depth of understanding and experience that is needed in a gas economy.
Yeah.
So we do not have that yet. There are many countries around the world that do have it. We've had Mosgas became Petroleum, and we had the gas coming off the Pandy and Tamani pipeline in Gauteng, and that really is about it. So the skill and understanding gap is something that we really need to pay attention to in the short term. And that's talking around LNG, but also the longer term would be what we're here for, which is the offshore opportunity. And that should really be done in parallel so that we can use LNG in the short term. Yes, of course, we must aggregate demand and so on and buy that and trade it sensibly. But over time, if we can get the offshore opportunity and the hydrocarbons that there to shore and into the South African economy from the 11B, 12B, and others like that, the effect that that would have on the fiscus, on our foreign exchange not going out of the country, I think it was something like 25 billion rand in 24 that was spent out of the country on petroleum products. And these effects would also insulate us to some degree against global geopolitics. And, having your own supply is a very, very powerful driver in the economy.
Yeah, I mean, if we're now importing the majority of our petrol and diesel as refined product because our refineries have largely shut down, there's also a national security issue, and obviously reversing that dependence has a strong energy security argument for it. When you look at the capacity, and you mentioned Mosgas, would you support reviving PetroSA's Mossel Bay gas to liquids plant? And if so, what are the kinds of regulatory or financing models that would enable that without loading the South African taxpayer with another potential Eskom style liability?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to have the policies and the regulations across multiple government departments, right through from, Treasury to environment to energy and transport and so on, better integrated. That would give investors more comfort. But, one thing about oil and gas and the investors in infrastructure and things like FSRUs is that they have worked and invested in very, very diverse markets, which would be from Venezuela through to Russia to New Zealand under very, very different conditions. So they're able to manage that uncertainty fairly well, I'd say. But the key thing in terms of what needs to be done to make projects bankable is to create an attractive investment environment. And the reality is that there are opportunities around the world, and Guyana is easily the most attractive investment opportunity at the moment, a new jurisdiction, followed very much by Namibia. And that is, it might sound counterintuitive, but I'm actually appreciative of Namibia because it is such an object lesson. It's an empirical test and example of what can be achieved very closely, very quickly. Quickly in our world
Yes.
is, the sort of 3 to 10 year.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, these are very capital intensive, long lead time projects,
Yes.
capital projects that we're talking about. And why you need now that policy certainty, the regulatory certainty. If you're going to be investing hundreds of millions just drilling for exploratory wells before you've even decided to go ahead, you need a lot more certainty. And Namibia is punting what it calls a dual track story. So you've got Orange Basin hydrocarbons and you've got an aggressive push into green hydrogen and renewables. Do you think that's the template? Drill and decarbonize at the same time? And is South Africa's policy environment capable of supporting that kind of coherent dual track strategy in its current form?
Well, all the major players are taking decarbonisation very seriously. As to whether hydrogen is the right parallel activity, I'm not the right person to speak to on that. Frankly, this is a personal view, not an OPASA one, is that we need to focus on where we have capacity, we believe there's some product, and get those projects underway and done, and not be distracted by other less certain opportunities. But hydrogen is not something that I have any particular experience in.
But more the idea of having this dual track strategy then, and again, if you read Michael Leibach's Hydrogen Ladder, there are very few practical applications to get me at a personal level very excited about green hydrogen. Yes, maybe in green steel and aviation fuels and ammonia, but I don't see it as the next fuel of the future for public transport, for example. But maybe let's come to the policy and regulatory gaps as you see it. And the big question clearly is, why isn't the capital flowing as it currently stands now? Because if you look at it, we sit next to Namibia's Orange Basin. It's one of the most exciting deepwater provinces in the world. We're not just talking in this region, in the world. Yet investment here is stalled. In simple terms, what are the one or two policy bottlenecks that keep global capital on the sidelines here?
I think the first one has got to be the transition from the NPRDA to the Upstream Petroleum Act. And the Upstream Petroleum Act is not yet in place. It has not yet been gazetted. And there's some issues in there that, especially around carry, the 10% carry, and then a 10% BEE amount. And one of the worries in the industry is around how, if you as an activist can appeal something that doesn't sit well with you, you can do that in a serial manner. So, you might have three things that you're unhappy about. You deal with one, the courts deal with it, and a year later you get a result, then you go on to the next one, and so on and so on. So you sterilize activity in the meantime. So that is a big concern in the industry at the moment in terms of things that could be hopefully streamlined in some way. The other is the opportunities that exist in other parts of the world. And the large companies go through investment planning on typically a sort of 3 to 5 year cycle. They're not going to be making decisions now about next year. but they'll be looking at what the prices are in this year to generate the money to do these very expensive operations. So unless they have a clear sense of comfort that this is a place that we can do business and we are insulated against changes in, for example, significant tax changes or nationalization or changes, so they will want the certainty written into contracts. And if they can get that elsewhere and the returns are quicker, that's what will happen. And that's something that the South African government needs to grapple with to make us a more attractive short-term investment opportunity. And frankly, I think that that applies to everything, not just to the oil and gas business.
And the other side is obviously the environmental side. And it seems that
Yeah,
every exploration campaign now ends up in court. We've had Shell's Wild Coast case, Search's seismic survey, fast becoming kind of the norm here. What's the
yeah.
solution? Faster processes, clearer consultation rules, or do we need a rethink of how environmental justice and energy development can coexist together?
I think that you've touched on all of the answers in there in terms of speedier processes, but nobody is for a moment, certainly on our side of the fence, saying that we need to do things, overly quickly or irresponsibly. And a robust impact assessment process, as we have, is a good thing. It forces you to identify potential risks, weigh those risks, and say what your mitigation strategies would then be for those. So clearly, those need to be adhered to. However, speed is a realistic consideration. The third one that I think we touched on earlier on is that we don't have a deep understanding of how oil and gas underpins an economy. And there is no serious argument made by any of the A team, that's sort of, the big multinationals, A team players, who would be saying it's fossil fuels or renewables. The answer to that is that it is and, not and or. And it's fossil fuels, especially in the form of gas, that will help to underpin any transition to more renewables. But right now, let me give you a practical example. If we had gone all out to renewables in, say, the past 15 years, in the past 2 weeks in Johannesburg, with very little sun and a lot of rain, and probably inadequate battery storage, things would have closed down. You have to have a robust form of energy with high calorific value that can underpin, like a gas could do. So in South Africa, we have a couple of peaking stations, and those are good, but they're not running gas at the moment. They were built for gas, they run on diesel. But peaking stations, whether they're through diesel or gas, can help us to build through those transitions when other forms of power are not immediately dispatchable and available. So the interaction between renewables and gas and oil is one that needs to be seen as complementary, not as in competition.
When you look at the funding of these projects, and it was interesting to me, Niall, and you mentioned that it's an and approach. I am seeing a lot more pragmatism in even multilateral declarations now around the need, obviously, to decarbonize, but also the need to ensure that we have affordable energy and energy security that underpins economic development. Because I think if one looks at it, certainly in the South African context, the environmentalists might point to protecting natural coastlines and fisheries, while the township entrepreneur will be pointing to reliable and affordable energy to ensure that they can
Yeah.
put food on the table. So, there is an inherent tension in all of this. But when it comes to funding in a world that is talking about decarbonizing, the global banks, the DFIs, the insurers are all tightening their fossil fuel exposure, often with explicit gas phase down timelines and things like that. Who realistically funds a multi-billion-dollar deepwater project in South Africa today? And do you see them putting different conditions than they were attaching maybe even 10 years ago?
So the funders would come into other parts of the value chain. The majors are not going to the bank to say, can we have, X billion dollars to go and explore? That's in their balance sheets and in their plans into the future. However, the other funders are going to have to be, I would guess, more realistic about funding, for example, storage pipelines, regas units, and there are any number of pieces of machinery and toys along the way that are going to have to find some kind of funding. The one caution I would throw in here is that exploration is not for the faint-hearted, and it is not the sort of activity that government, certainly South African government, should be involved in the primary stages, simply because it is such high risk. And here we have the opportunity, while other players have expressed interest and are actively interested, we should take that and make that opportunity happen.
Niall, I've got to ask you as a final question. Imagine we're having this conversation again in 2040. We've managed to sort out some of those missing pieces, and we finally have a modern, finalized upstream petroleum law. And it doesn't have all of those unclear BE participation issues and ambiguity on state participation and all of these vague rules. And it's actually fit for purpose. What does our energy system look like? What does South Africa's energy future look like? And what role does offshore oil and gas actually play in getting us there?
You're basically asking me what my vision is for 40 years from here. And in 40 years, my vision would be that we would have a highly functioning, highly productive system with a significant amount of both oil and gas, as well as renewables and any other forms of power. I think we're going to need all of the energy sources we can get. We should, in that decision to get to that point, trade-offs have to be made. And there is no one form of energy that is inherently better on every criterion than others. What is best for us right now into that 40-year gap is very importantly to keep the gas and oil equation or activity in there underpinning it. There are certainly environmental negatives to all forms of energy, but on the other hand, we have a massive economic problem, certainly a jobs problem, and this could help address that over that 40-year period. One thing I want to add within that is that people often focus on the jobs in the oil and gas industry. The real kicker in this comes from having abundant energy readily available across an economy. And there's never been an economy anywhere ever that has developed and is productive and enjoys a high standard of living without abundant energy. And the opportunity for us to underpin abundant energy is with us right now. We need to grab it and use it.
Well, that's where we'll leave it. Thank you very much, Niall Kramer. You've heard OPASA's argument that offshore oil and gas is this opportunity that could really help pull South Africa out of its low growth, high unemployment trap, and that projects like 11B and 12B, amongst others, might anchor a new industrial value chain, port upgrades and skills, and really that gas, if properly governed, can be that transitional tool rather than a new addiction. In the end, it isn't just a fight between drill and don't drill. I think it's a test of our institutions. Can South Africa design a framework that's transparent, predictable, and credible enough to convince investors that projects will be profitable and that citizens will benefit and those won't vanish into the usual black holes? Can we also avoid importing other people's narratives while still respecting the physics of the climate and of energy and of economic growth? Well, those are the fault lines that I think bankers and policymakers and boards will have to navigate over the next decade, because doing nothing is also a choice with its own immense costs as well. My thanks to Niall Kramer from OPASA for joining me, and to you for listening as always. I'm Michael Avery, and this has been the Monocle Banking Podcast. Until next time, stay curious.